everyone, it's Frankie-Lou. I'm coming to you today from the kitchen at the Grow Together homestead, where I was hoping to do a little video here that might help you with some of the seed purchases that you're making right now. I did one earlier that some of you may have seen about growing zones and how that affects your perennial plant purchases. But if you're growing a lot of veggies and a lot of annual flowers like I do myself, then there is another thing that you really should be aware of before you go and start purchasing a lot of your seeds, particularly if you're new to planting or new to your area. And that is knowing the frost-free days that are in your region. Now, this might not matter if you live somewhere where it's got a nice temperate climate, but if you do live in a colder climate like I do myself in southern Alberta, that's a critical thing to know. And the reason being is if you look at your seed packets, okay, I've got 6 different kinds of seed packets here. And on these seed packets, there usually is somewhere listed for your annual flowers or your annual vegetables, a number of days, okay? On these West Coast seeds, it's right here, it says 70 to 90 days. It's usually put pretty prominently. I do know that some I have had to search, but most seed companies will give you fairly prominently somewhere on the packaging the number of days to maturity or days to harvest, okay? Now, what you want to ensure is when you are growing these vegetables, that those days to maturity and days to harvest will coincide with your frost-free days. Now, what is really important to remember is those days to maturity or days to harvest are under ideal conditions, okay? So a lot of people think, oh, I've got frost-free days from the beginning of June to mid-September. So somebody with that kind of growing season may think, I can get away with growing anything that's 100 days or less. But that might not necessarily be true, because these packages, these dates and these numbers that they've generated on these packages are based on ideal growing conditions for that type of plant. So for instance, if you're dealing with brassicas, which are cold-loving vegetables, those would be your kohlrabis and your kale, cabbages and cauliflowers. Yes, those ideal growing conditions, those are cold-loving plants. So any day that's not frosty, that would count in your 55 to 60 day count there. But when you are dealing with some of your more heat-loving plants, like your cucumbers and your peppers and your tomatoes, okay, those plants will not function on a day that's close to freezing, okay, or close to frost. I've read some sites that they say, oh, please don't put your tomatoes out until it's consistently above 9 degrees at night. Well, that doesn't happen consistently where I grow. I often have a 9-degree night in July, okay, here in southern Alberta. So that day, if my plants are out in the garden, or that day, instead of in my heated greenhouse at night, that day is kind of a lost day, okay? Because that plant is not going to be growing. Yes, it might not be frosty, but that's not an ideal growing condition day, okay? So when I worked at the garden center and people would come up to me and say, okay, I got 90 frost-free days, so I can get away with this particular variety because it's a 90-day variety. Not necessarily so, because A, that ideal growing conditions. B, it's not from the day you put the seed in the ground. It's from the day that plant has become a seedling, okay, and it's ready to go. Either you've put it in the ground from something that you started inside, or that has begun to grow outside on its own. And then there's another thing. You can do things like start some seeds inside to get them started early, but there will be a period of shock that goes on when you transplant something from indoor growing lights into your garden bed. I usually say you're going to lose 4 to 5 days at least in shock, okay? So these are all factors that you want to think of when you're looking at varieties that you can grow in your garden. I, in particular, am always looking at different tomatoes to grow. I know that because I have the greenhouse going, I can go with some of the longer season tomatoes. But when I was growing outside, I was just looking for what's the shortest season heirloom tomato I could save seeds from, and I would grow those, okay? Because I know that there is very erratic temperature changes here, which are not ideal growing conditions for tomatoes, okay? So that might seem a little bit fussy, but these are the factors that you need to think about when you are purchasing seeds based on the dates to harvest that's on here, and your frost-free days you have in your area. So, sources for learning your frost-free days. Well, I've gone on to I hate to say this, but I have gone onto the Government of Canada site, and that frost-free day section is quite clunky, okay? So, as I've said in my earlier videos, when you're dealing with conditions in your areas, it's best to find out what's going on with your neighbors. Calculate it yourself if you want to. You could, I had to do that out here. I had to keep records. I've had my last frost mid-June, and my first frost happened on the last day of August, okay? So you can see there, that's like 75 days frost-free. It's not a very long growing season when you go into factor. If I'm putting a seed in the ground and it's not germinating for 10 days, I have to add that onto the calculation of whether that seed's going to be grow well in my yard. Now there are some things that you can do to help push those frost dates. Number one for me has been having raised beds. That's because I find that the soil does heat up faster, and it's easier to mitigate the damage of frost days. It's much easier to mount polycarbonate or coverings, and almost make little mini cold frames around each of my raised beds if I'm going to have a sudden change in temperature, or it's near the end of the season or near the beginning of the season where those frost-free days get tightened up. Okay, so that gives me a little bit more time on either side. Another thing you can do is you can obviously get your seedlings started a little bit earlier, give them a head start. And yes, as I said, you could do the indoor under lights, okay? I do that with my onions because they have a really long growing season. Number one way that I do to extend my season, and that is to do the milk jug sowing. Because for me, that saves me at least a week's worth of time where I don't have to be hardening off my seedlings. When it's time to put those seedlings in the ground, they're hardened off. That saves me a lot of time in terms of my frost-free days, because those plants are already ready to get in the ground, and I don't lose that shock time that tends to happen when you're getting your seedlings from inside ready to go outside. Also, if you don't want to do the recording of your frost-free days yourself, it is good to try to find your local horticultural club, okay? Or actually talk to your neighbors, your gardening neighbors, and find out what varieties of plants and annual vegetables and annual flowers are growing well in their neighborhood. It's amazing how sometimes something like a tomato, you think you can grow one variety of tomato, and it's just not long enough. The ideal conditions you don't have the ideal conditions in your yard. But you might talk to a neighbor and find out, hey, this Manitoba variety, it's gonna go great here. Oh, this Russian variety tomato, it grows great in this neighborhood. Okay, there are other things that will impact, obviously, like your soil nutrition, which we'll talk about because we always talk about that several times a year. You're creating microclimates, but honestly, talking to your neighbors, talking to your horticultural club, that's going to be a big asset for you for finding out what your frost-free days are and what varieties of plants you can grow in your area. So one of the reasons why you want to do this is when you go to a large big box store and you see these wonderful, wonderful racks of seeds. Those racks of seeds are the same pretty much at every store across the country. Okay, they just stock them up that way. And so there will be varieties in those seed racks that are not going to grow in your region if you live in a colder region unless you take those extra mitigating factors. Okay, that's one of the reasons why sometimes it's better to shop at your local garden center as well, because they're more likely to be very selective about what they choose to have on their shelves. Their racks aren't as big for a reason, because usually they're going to have a smaller selection of stuff that will actually work in your region. Okay, so I hope that was helpful. Please do continue to pepper me with questions. Please do subscribe if you're interested in seeing some of the other stuff that's going on here at the homestead. And as always, I hope you take this chance to grow together today.